Hello everyone, I'm your instructor Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about social justice and health equity. This lecture will cover the Powers and Faden reading from week 6. So let's move along. So here's a quote from the Powers and Faden reading that I think captures really one of the most important themes of their approach to social justice and health equity. So it says, inequalities in health are of most importance when they are avoidable and when they co-travel with clusters of disadvantaging determinants that undermine multiple dimensions of well-being. So this is something important to focus on, and I want you to really focus on this phrase about co-travel with clusters of disadvantaging determinants. So for example, if you think of racism, for instance, there are many disadvantaging determinants that affect multiple dimensions of well-being related to racism. Racism can affect a person's ability to access education, to access employment. It can affect their ability to access healthcare, and all these things can affect their lives in multiple ways. Obviously, your access to education, your access to employment can affect your income, and that can affect your well-being. Racism can both directly and indirectly affect your ability to access housing, can affect where you live. That might make a difference to what kinds of toxins, what kinds of air you breathe, etc., and that might also have health effects. And so here the idea is you see this cluster of things that tend to go together, and they all tend to disadvantage a person with regard to health, and Powers and Faden would emphasize also with regard to other dimensions of well-being. So this is a key idea. And so if you think of, for example, a difference in life outcomes and sort of lifespan between men and women in the same country, in many countries women tend to live longer than men, Powers and Faden would say that's less clear. That's not clear that that's a justice issue, because because men tend to have in fact more advantaged determinants compared to women in society more broadly. So you don't have this cluster of disadvantaging determinants. So let's dive into their view a little bit more. So Powers and Faden argue that public health goal is social justice, not the utilitarian maximization of population health. And this is something we're going to talk about in class, but keep that in mind. They're arguing that the main goal of public health shouldn't just be maximizing, quality adjusted life years in the population. It should be social justice. They write, justice, in our view, requires ensuring for everyone a sufficient amount of each of the essential dimensions of well-being, of which health is one. Thus, in our account, bringing about health is a specific objective of social justice. So there are 6 dimensions of social justice. R1, health, which they mentioned, personal security, which is what it sounds like, reasoning, which means the ability to think and reason clearly, which requires things like education. It might require sort of a healthy cognitive state. And respect, this is mainly respect from other people and also respect for oneself. So for example, racial discrimination is obviously something that's contrary to respect from others. Attachment, that means the ability to form emotional attachments to others. And self-determination. And in Powers and Faden's approach to social justice and public health, they emphasize these what they call twin moral impulses. That is, to improve human well-being by improving health, and to do so in a particular way by focusing on the needs of those who are most disadvantaged. And as we'll see, these are sort of 2 themes that we'll associate with two different principles. That one of them we've encountered already, and this is an idea of prioritarianism. Prioritarianism, as we've discussed, is an approach to equity that emphasizes the needs of those who are the least well off, or those who have the greatest, say, needs for healthcare or for other things. So in Powers and Faden's word, a commitment to social justice, as we explicate it, attaches a special moral urgency to remediating the conditions of those whose life prospects are poor across multiple dimensions of well-being. So, for example, a group that's subject to racial discrimination is often going to be disadvantaged in many different respects, including health, respect, for example, from society, and so on. And this is the kind of thing that's going to be a special focus of social justice from their point of view. They also refer to this as the negative or remedial point of justice, counteracting systemic disadvantage of certain groups. And they list or in the reading for this week, list three sort of groups, groups that are disadvantaged by some sort of social categorization, such as gender or race, people who are just poor, and children. And children is an interesting case because in this instance, with regard to children, they emphasize the importance of maintaining the actual achievement of things like health, education, and so on, rather than simply the opportunity to gain those things, which become more important as people become adults. People have more freedom to choose how much education they want, how much they want to devote themselves to being healthy, and so on, whereas for children, it's just important to ensure that they actually achieve those things. The second theme is sufficientarianism. This is sort of a new word, but sufficientarianism is the idea that equity has to do with making sure everybody has enough. And so that inequalities are unfair or they're unjust when you have some people have more than they need and other people don't have enough. They don't have enough to some key feature or key resource in life. So Powers and Faden say that any society that fails to ensure for its members the conditions necessary to achieve a sufficient level of health is an unjust society that, in our view, has violated a basic human right. And they call this the positive or aspirational point of justice, to secure sufficient conditions for well-being for all. Now, sufficientarianism is a view that faces a few objections and concerns. One kind of objection about sufficientarianism is where exactly you draw this line of sufficiency. On this point, Powers and Faden say that this line cannot be drawn universally, and it can't, in most cases, even be drawn in a really precise way. But they suggest that what is sufficient is often going to be contextually specific to a particular society. And also they emphasize that on their account, the sufficiency applies not to things like, say, the amount of money that someone has or the amount of, say, healthcare access that someone has, but on well-being itself, so like health itself, rather than, say, on the amount of money somebody has. So this is an important feature of their view. All right, so let's look at another aspect of their approach, and that is the difference between ideal and non-ideal theory. As Powers and Faden point out, their theory has a kind of ideal component and a non-ideal component. So first of all, what's ideal theory? Ideal theory is an approach to theorizing about, in this context, if we're talking about equity or fairness or justice, ideal theory proposes these sort of principles for a perfectly fair and just society. It's like you sort of think, what would a really fair society be like? And you come up with this sort of imaginative picture and try to come up with these principles of what a perfectly good society would be. Non-ideal theory, on the other hand, is less concerned with coming up with this ideal image of the perfect society, and instead examines the mechanisms, the processes that generate injustices in actual societies, and proposes strategies for counteracting them. So, in philosophy, John Rawls' 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, is one of the most classic examples of ideal theory. And Charles Mill's 1997 book, The Racial Contract, is a classic example of non-ideal theory. And in fact, Mills, to a large extent, is criticizing Rawls's sort of ideal theory approach. I'll have a second lecture that talks a bit about Rawls's theory of justice and its relationship to public health as a sort of bonus lecture, and you can look at that if you like. And in the readings that we have for this week, the Lang and colleagues paper is definitely an example of non-ideal theory. So Powers and Faden emphasize that their theory contains both ideal and non-ideal elements. The ideal element is this criterion that a just society is one that ensures the conditions for its members to achieve a sufficient level of each of these 6 essential dimensions of well-being. So a society that fails to do that, a society that does not provide conditions where everyone can, be healthy, where people can, have respect, etc., that is a society that's unjust. So it has this criterion for what an ideally just society would be like, but at the same time, it really has an emphasis on mechanisms like racism and economic inequality that prevent some groups of people from attaining sufficient levels of well-being. And so going back to the sufficientarianism and prioritarianism, you can see that the ideal is this sort of sufficientarianist rule. It's the idea that everyone should have these, access to these conditions that allow the sufficient level of these good things. Whereas the non-ideal part is the part linked to prioritarianism, where the focus is on what are the mechanisms in society that prevent some people or some groups of people from being able to attain sufficient levels of these dimensions of well-being, specifically health, since that's what we're interested in this class. So if you put these pieces together, you've got a picture that sort of looks like this. You've got this sufficient level. So if we're talking about health, there's some sufficient level of health that's regarded as something that all society should aim for. And one of the things you might have noticed from the readings is that Powers and Faden reject the WHO's definition of health as this highest attainable standard, and they say this sort of goes overboard. And in fact, they point out, for instance, that the WHO often will measure health achievement in countries by comparison to lifespan in Japan, which is a country that has the world's longest lifespan, and they say this is kind of going overboard. We should think of a sufficient level. And so in that way, their view of health is actually a bit similar to Liao's approach that we read for last week, where he's talking about basic health. And I think when they talk about a sufficient level of health, it's something more like that. Interestingly, though, they're interested in inequalities in things like wealth or income or political power above this sort of sufficient level, because those inequalities might be part of mechanisms that prevent some people from being able to achieve a sufficient level of health. So, in other words, the prioritarianism part is specifically focused on the people who fall below this level, and of course, the more they fall below, the more they're going to be concerned with it, and they're concerned with the mechanisms that explain why this is the case. And in some cases, those might be involving mechanisms that explain why some people are just way above the sufficient level. Okay, so to get a sense of this, it's helpful to look at this table 2, which is from page 97 of the readings. And in this table, Powers and Faden list a number of different inequalities in health outcomes, in this case lifespan, and sort of give you a sense of whether they think those are really serious health equity issues or not. So let's take a few examples. So for instance, white U.S. males compared to African American males, there's a what about a 6-7 year difference, or 6.6 year difference in lifespan, and they suggest this is a health inequity, that's of serious concern, because for the obvious reasons that this difference in outcomes is likely linked to racial discrimination in the United States. And that's, of course, this thing that clusters and creates this sort of cluster of reinforcing disadvantages. Comparing U.S. males versus U.S. females, well, that's less clearly of a concern, and not simply because, even though it's a kind of similar in its magnitude, but the reason is that the U.S. males are not sort of systemically disadvantaged compared to females in U.S. society. In fact, in many ways, it's the opposite. Conversely, if we think of the Japanese citizens versus citizens of Sierra Leone, there's this huge difference. But it's not just the size of the difference that matters, it's the fact that why this difference in health outcomes exists, in part, for example, due to colonialism and so on, and those effects on the well-being of people in Sierra Leone is an important part of this. And so here the idea is there's some systemic explanation as to why you've got this difference. One slightly humorous example that I'll end with is the difference in lifespan between Oscar-winning actors and match controls, that is, actors who are, I guess, similar in other qualities but never won an Oscar. And you'll see that the Oscar-winning actors live longer. This is kind of a neat example to call into question the idea that it actually makes sense to say that people have a right to the highest attainable standard if, winning an Oscar is going to make you live longer because you feel so happy after you won it or something, maybe gives you another 4 years of life. Well, not everybody can win an Oscar. That's not even possible, right? And so this would be an example as to why something more like a right to basic health would be something that might make more sense according to Powers and Faden. All right, so I'll stop here and we'll discuss Powers and Faden's view in more detail in class. Bye-bye.